One of the things I love about the new wave is while I'm watching, I get the feeling that I'm actually there with the characters in real life. The new wave was a movement started in France in the late 50s and, according to the New York Times, became represented by the 1959 film Breathless, directed by Jean-Luc Godard. As said by a critic of Breathless named Richard Brody, the film moved at the speed of the mind and seemed unlike anything that preceded it, a live recording of one person thinking in real time. According to the book, A History of the French New Wave Cinema, the New Wave dramatically changed filmmaking inside and outside France by encouraging new styles, themes, and modes of productions throughout the world. By the time the New Wave came around, the French film industry had been renowned for many decades, so the quality of the New Wave films came naturally. In areas like Hong Kong, however, once the new wave was realized about 15 years later, it was much harder for the industry to figure themselves out, for China, historically being isolationist, was out of touch with the reforms of film. Hong Kong's film industry was successful, but mostly making kung fu movies before the new wave inspiration hit, as explained in an article from Movements in Film. And so, we now ask, how did elements of the French New Wave translate into Hong Kong cinema? To gain an understanding, I'm going to first present a shining example of the French New Wave, the film Elevator to the Gallows, directed by Louis Malle and released in 1958, and compare it to Boat People, released in 1982 and directed by An Hui, considered one of the best Hong Kong New Wave films. And we'll see how some of the French New Wave translates into the world of Hong Kong cinema through the exploitation of mise en scène, the composition, the presentation of it all. I've always found the way New Wave films try to add meaning with little mise en scène tricks that really bring out the emotions of a place. Mise en scène, translated from French, is the arrangement of a set on stage, and as stated on Studio Binder, defines how everything in front of the camera comes together for the viewers. Arguably, however, mise en scène's most important role is in creating the poetic subtext of a film. Elevator to the Gallows was one of Louis Malle's first films, produced when he was only 24. Despite this, it still feels like a classic, an exploration of doom, postponed but never escaped in the grand city of Paris. Elevator to the Gallows follows Florence Carola, which made actress Jean Moreau a worldwide star who has an affair with Julien Tavernier, a veteran of the Indochinese or the Vietnamese War. Louis Malle, reflecting on the film, said, "I was split between my tremendous admiration for Robert Bresson and the temptation to make a Hitchcock-like film. The film was intended to be a French take on Hitchcock's suspenseful, masterfully crafted films, something very ambitious for such a young director." The film is also known for its excellent soundtrack, improvised by Miles Davis. I find it really helps to bring out the inner turmoil of the characters. It was very well received despite having a somewhat convoluted main plot, as it presented a starry image of Paris and an exploration of the ironies of entrapment. Boat People, on the other hand, was done by director Anne Hui much later in her career. It was the last film in her Vietnam trilogy and meant to portray life in Vietnam after the Vietnam War and the Sino-Vietnamese War. The film follows a Japanese photojournalist named Shiomi Akutagawa, George Lam, who is sent to Vietnam to take photos. He is supposed to represent the director's position as an Asian with bicultural heritage. In an article by the Criterion Collection, the film is said to be filmed entirely in Hong Kong, despite taking place in Vietnam and originally spoken in Cantonese, as the Chinese were the intended audience. The Criterion Collection article explains that it was originally supposed to be more about boat people. The focus was changed to a fictional documentary/melodrama style of life in Vietnam when filming at sea was found to be too expensive given the conditions. The Criterion Collection also explains the film to be considered very controversial, as it offered an extremely negative view of the Vietnamese regime at the time, considered unfair by most Americans and French, but heavily celebrated in China for its humanistic views and messages. It was one of the defining movies of Hong Kong cinema, launching the career of all its participants, though it was mostly a domestic hit. Let us now look at an example of how the mise en scène of Elevator to the Gallows compares to Boat People's mise en scène. Both films use mise en scène to enhance emotions of bliss, which are seen as mere ignorance by the viewers. In Boat People, this is done in the beginning of the movie, when Shiomi, the photojournalist, is taking photographs of the children in one of the government's new zone projects. We learn later in the film that these zones are much worse to live in than it initially seems, as the owners set up their zones to make them look appealing to foreigners. Before Shiomi is aware of this, though, the area looks as happy as can be. Helped with the compositional arrangements of the children. They are all grouped together while the adults seem to hover around excitedly. The cluster is framed around exotic fauna that brings to mind feelings of an island paradise. The framing works to show how the Vietnamese new zones initially seem to be blooming places filled with life, the people of the zones framed by nature, presenting Shiomi's initial view that the people live in harmony here. In Elevator to the Gallows, when Julien is conversing with his boss, before he takes out his gun, the boss seems blissfully unaware of his demise to come, enhanced by the beautiful city of Paris in the backdrop and the open design of the office. We can connect the feeling the mise en scène gives with the wondrous mood Julien's boss seems to be in, leaving Julien as an outlier, suggesting that he can't see all the wonder of Paris. He is still caught up in the moods of the wars he fought in previously. Similar ideas of bliss found within the homeland, as in boat people are here. It's interpreted to be in the freedom to bask in the magnificence of a great city, emphasized by the open view of Paris stretching out in the distance. In boat people, bliss is defined as life in a simple, flowering community where everyone looks out for each other, viewed through a beautiful natural frame. I think Boat People holds up compared to Elevator to the Gallows, given the difference in the story that is pursued. Both films also take a different approach to the use of mirrors on set, an element commonly seen in the new wave. In Elevator to the Gallows, there is a scene in which you can see Julien in an elevator with two other people. Julien, as we know, has committed a terrible crime that the other two are completely unaware of. To emphasize this, there is a shot where the other two can only be seen through the reflection of the elevator button panel, whereas Julien is shown outside of the reflection. I could clearly see here that the director was using the set pieces to separate Julien from the other two in the picture. The other two are small annoyances in his grand plan. He thinks nothing of them. There is a scene where Shiomi Atagawa converses with a Vietnamese girl he has both been interested in and worried about. At the moment, he is very upset with her, for he just saw the horrors of Vietnam that she doesn't seem to be taking too seriously. There is a long shot in this sequence showing both of them through a mirror with a lot of clutter in between them. The mirror creates a strange and awkward effect where the clutter on the desk in front of it loses definition and becomes shallow. This is used to represent the complicated feelings about the Vietnamese girl Shiomi has. He wants to help her, but is also easily angered by what he thinks to be her foolishness. Like in Elevator to the Gallows, the mirror is used to show character relations. The mirror also serves to show the awkwardness of the situation for the Vietnamese girl, as she doesn't quite understand where his anger is coming from. Unlike Elevator to the Gallows, Boat People uses mirrors more for means of framing a situation as conflicting, whereas in the French film, the mirror is used to separate a person from the people around him. While I can understand the intent behind the use of mirrors in Boat People, it feels much more like an attempt to make a scene more interesting rather than an attempt to add more depth to the characters, like in the French movie. We already know Shiomi is struggling to deal with his anger for being deceived. The mirror doesn't add this emotion. Elevator to the Gallows uses mise en scène on another level than Boat People. The form is generally more coherent and builds the story in interesting, not confusing ways. But this is a film from La Pays de France, a country with a long history of making revolutionary films. Given Hong Kong's film history as a place mostly known for kung fu movies before its first new wave, influenced by limited contact with Western cinema in a historically isolationist country, heavily monitored by its government, I think elements of the new wave translated fairly well, all things considered, you know. At the very least, the new wave ideas of mise en scène translated into this film, and I could definitely see inspirations from the French New Wave, despite it being regarded as a propaganda film. Did they miss the mark sometimes? Yes, I consider the story of the movie to become too black and white, too unfair to the Vietnamese, and many of the characters not very well fleshed out, probably because the film script had to be approved by the Chinese government. So, given all of the barriers boat people had to go through, I think it was a novel Chinese translation of the New Wave. I'm sorry, I mean a Hong Kongese translation of the New Wave, with some takes on mise en scène I could appreciate. As for Elevator to the Gallows, a great classic in my book, you should watch it without hesitating unless you're scared of rich Germans or something.